Neil Carver's hand crushed the crystal glass with such force that the shards pierced his palm, blood dripping between his fingers, as he watched Otto Johnson lean dangerously close to Diana, whispering something that made her eyes widen in panic. Neil couldn't hear that bastard's words through the crowded hall of Ashford, a discreet Pennsylvania town where the criminal elite hid under masks of philanthropy. But he could see perfectly Otto's hand sliding down Diana's waist, claiming territory that didn't belong to him. The charity auction continued around them, animated voices bidding on artwork and luxury experiences. But for Neil, the world had reduced to that unbearable scene. Otto Johnson, the arrogant bastard who controlled arms trafficking on the East Coast, was touching the only woman Neil Carver had decided would be his. There was no negotiation. There was no discussion. Diana Winters was his, even if she didn't know it yet. Neil dropped the bloodied glass shards on the table, ignoring the shocked looks from the guests around him, and began walking toward the stage with measured, lethal steps. His ice-blue eyes fixed on Otto with a murderous intensity that made 3 security guards instinctively step back as he passed. The black Armani suit he wore was impeccable, every movement calculated, every muscle tense beneath the expensive fabric. Neil was 35 years old and had built his empire of smuggling and extortion with blood, sweat, and strategic brutality that made grown men beg for mercy. He didn't beg. He took. And at that moment, he was about to take Diana in front of 300 people who thought they knew the limits of power. Hello, I'm Rachel Ashwood, and you're about to dive into a story of obsession, power, and brutal claiming. Subscribe to the channel so this story reaches more people. Leave your like, share, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Remember that this is a narration, fictional content created for entertainment. Now, let's continue. Diana Winters felt the air change before she saw Neil. It was as if the temperature of the hall had dropped 10 degrees, a predatory cold that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She was trapped in conversation with Otto, the influential businessman who had approached her 3 months ago with lucrative job proposals and invitations to exclusive events. Diana was a corporate attorney, specializing in mergers and acquisitions, and had made the mistake of accepting Otto's invitation to this charity event, thinking it would be a quiet evening of networking. She had no idea that Otto was much more than a successful businessman. She didn't know that he controlled a criminal network that extended across 6 states. And she definitely didn't know that by agreeing to be by his side that night, she had placed herself directly in the crosshairs of Neil Carver, the most dangerous man in Ashford. Otto was in the middle of a sentence, something about how Diana should consider working exclusively for his companies, when his voice died abruptly. His eyes widened, fixing on something behind her, and Diana saw genuine fear cross his face for the first time since she'd met him. She turned slowly and her heart stopped. Neil Carver was 3 meters away, standing in the middle of the hall like a predator who had located his prey. Blood still dripped from his right hand, dripping onto the polished marble floor, but he didn't even seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made Diana's stomach turn, a mixture of possessive desire and murderous fury that left her completely immobile. But what Neil would do next would shock everyone present in a way no one would ever forget. Diana knew Neil Carver only by reputation. Whispers in the corridors of law offices about the man who controlled half of Pennsylvania's illegal businesses, the ghost who was never indicted because witnesses disappeared and evidence evaporated. She had seen him in passing at 2 previous events, always surrounded by men in suits who were clearly bodyguards, always observing everything with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness, every vulnerability. Diana had felt the weight of that gaze on her on both occasions, a scrutiny so intense that she had left the events with trembling hands, but never imagined it meant anything beyond her own paranoia. Now, seeing Neil walk toward her with absolute purpose, Diana realized with growing horror that she hadn't been paranoid. She had been observed, studied, chosen. Otto finally recovered his voice, placing himself in front of Diana in a gesture that could have been protective if it weren't so obviously territorial. His voice came out tense, forcedly casual, but Diana could feel the tension radiating from him in waves. Otto was tall, well-built, with perfectly styled blonde hair, and a smile he used as a weapon in negotiations. But at that moment, facing Neil, he suddenly seemed smaller, less impressive. Neil stopped 1 meter away, and Diana could see up close the details that distance had hidden. He was slightly taller than Otto, with broad shoulders and a physical presence that dominated the space around him. His black hair was combed back, revealing a face of hard lines, strong jaw, and a thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow. But it was the eyes that held attention, blue as Arctic ice and completely devoid of mercy at that moment. Neil ignored Otto completely, his eyes fixed on Diana as if no one else existed in the hall. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but loaded with an authority that made Diana's blood freeze. Each word was a statement, not a request. He wasn't asking permission. He was establishing facts. Neil said he needed to speak with Diana now, and that Otto should step aside. The way he said it, the absolute tone, made it clear there was no room for discussion. Otto tried to laugh, a pathetic attempt to maintain the facade of control, and responded that Diana was with him, that Neil would have to wait his turn. The silence that followed was deafening. Conversations around them began to die as people realized something was happening, that the tension between these two men was about to explode. Diana felt all eyes in the hall turn toward them, 300 people suddenly fascinated by the drama unfolding. Neil tilted his head slightly, a predatory movement, and then smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile a shark gives before attacking, full of teeth and promises of violence. He told Otto there were no turns when it came to Diana, that Otto had made a fundamental mistake in thinking he could claim her, and that this mistake was about to cost him dearly. Then, before Diana could process what was happening, Neil moved. The speed was shocking. 1 second Neil was standing still, and the next he had grabbed Otto by the lapel of his jacket and pulled him forward with brutal force. Otto tried to react, his survival instincts finally awakening, but Neil was faster, stronger, and infinitely more experienced in violence. Neil's fist connected with Otto's face with a nauseating sound that echoed through the hall, instantly breaking his nose. Blood spurted, staining Otto's expensive tuxedo, and screams began to echo around them. Diana stood paralyzed, unable to move as she watched Neil hit Otto repeatedly, each blow calculated to cause maximum pain without killing. Otto fell to his knees, trying to protect his face with his hands, but Neil grabbed him by the hair and forced him to look up at Diana. Neil's voice cut through the chaos, clear and lethal, telling Otto he should never look at Diana again, never speak to her again, never think about her again, because Diana belonged to Neil Carver, and any man who forgot that would end up much worse than Otto was at that moment. Then Neil released Otto, who collapsed on the floor like a rag doll, and turned to Diana. And it was at that moment Diana realized her life would never be the same again. Neil extended his bloodied hand to Diana, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that left her breathless. He didn't ask. He ordered. He told her to come with him, to leave that place, to accept what was inevitable. Diana looked at his hand, at Otto's blood still fresh on his fingers, and then at the 300 shocked faces watching her every move. Part of her wanted to run, scream, call the police, do anything to escape this clearly dangerous man. But another part, a part she didn't know existed, was fascinated. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered in the entire world. No one had ever risked everything, in front of hundreds of witnesses, just to claim her as his. Diana felt her hand move before her brain could process the decision, her fingers touching Neil's, and then he pulled her against his chest with possessive force. His arm wrapped around her waist, holding her so firmly she could feel every tense muscle through his suit. Neil looked around the hall, his eyes challenging anyone to question what was happening, and then did something that made Diana's heart stop completely. He removed the signet ring from his left hand, a heavy piece of gold with the Carver family crest engraved, and held it in front of all those present. Then Neil slid the ring onto Diana's ring finger, marking her as property of the Carver family before the entire criminal underworld of Ashford. The hall exploded in shocked whispers. Diana looked at the ring on her finger, the metal still warm from Neil's body, and felt the reality of the situation finally penetrate. This wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a declaration of war. It was Neil telling all the powerful men in that hall that Diana was out of reach, protected, possessed. It was him putting a target on her back and simultaneously ensuring no one would dare hit it. Diana tried to speak, her voice coming out trembling, asking what Neil thought he was doing, but he simply silenced her by placing a finger over her lips. His eyes softened minimally, the murderous fury giving way to something equally intense but different, something that seemed dangerously close to adoration. Neil said he was doing what he should have done months ago, that he was claiming what was his, and that Diana could fight against it as much as she wanted, but the result would be the same. She was his now. Completely. Irrevocably. Forever. Then, before Diana could protest, Neil lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing and began walking toward the exit. The guests automatically stepped aside, creating a path, no one daring to interfere. Diana could see faces passing in a blur, some shocked, some envious, some clearly calculating the political implications of what they had just witnessed. Otto was still on the floor, being attended to by 2 security guards, his face a bloody mess, but his eyes followed Neil and Diana with pure hatred. Diana knew this wasn't over, that Otto Johnson wasn't the kind of man who accepted public humiliation without retaliation. But as Neil carried her out of the hall, Diana realized she was more worried about what would happen next than about Otto's revenge. Neil's limousine was waiting at the entrance, black and gleaming under the streetlights. A man in a suit immediately opened the rear door, his eyes carefully avoiding looking directly at Diana, and Neil placed her on the soft leather seat before entering behind her. The door closed with a definitive sound, isolating them from the outside world, and Diana finally found her voice. She demanded to know what Neil thought he was doing, who he thought he was to simply take her as if she were property, and that he should take her back immediately. Neil watched her speak, his eyes traveling over her face with an intensity that made Diana's words die in her throat. Then he leaned forward, invading her personal space, and said he knew exactly who he was. He was Neil Carver, the man who controlled Ashford, the man who had built an empire from nothing, and the man who had decided 6 months ago that Diana Winters would be his wife. He said he had observed Diana for half a year, learning everything about her, her habits, her preferences, her fears, her dreams. He knew she drank black coffee without sugar every morning at 7 at the coffee shop on the corner of her office. He knew she worked late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He knew she visited her mother in a nursing home in Harrisburg every first Sunday of the month. He knew she had ended a 3-year relationship 8 months ago and hadn't dated anyone since. He knew everything and had waited patiently for the right moment to make his move. And then Otto Johnson had made the mistake of touching what belonged to Neil. Diana felt a chill run down her spine as she processed Neil's words. This was madness. This was obsession on a level she had never experienced. But the scariest part was that somewhere deep inside her, a part Diana didn't want to acknowledge, was thrilled. She had spent years being ignored, being treated as just another competent but replaceable lawyer, just another pretty but not extraordinary woman. No one had ever looked at her as if she were irreplaceable. No one had ever fought for her. And now, Neil Carver, one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Pennsylvania, was saying she was his, that he had waited months just for the right moment to claim her. Diana tried to cling to logic, to sanity, telling Neil he couldn't just decide she was his, that she had choices, that she wasn't property. Neil smiled, and it was a genuine smile this time, almost affectionate, and said Diana was absolutely right. She had choices. She could fight against this, could try to run, could even go to the police, though they wouldn't do anything because half of them were on his payroll. But in the end, the result would be the same, because Neil never gave up on what he wanted, and he wanted Diana with an intensity that scared even him. So he offered her a different choice. She could accept the inevitable now, could let him show her how good their life could be together, or she could make things difficult and discover exactly how far Neil was willing to go to keep her. Diana looked into his eyes and saw the absolute truth in those words, and knew her life had changed irrevocably that night. The limousine glided through the streets of Ashford, passing through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, until finally stopping in front of a mansion Diana recognized from local news. The Carver property was legendary, a modern fortress hidden behind high walls and impenetrable security, the kind of place ordinary people only saw in photos. Neil got out first and extended his hand to Diana, and she realized this was the moment of truth. She could refuse, could scream, could make a scene, but looking at Neil's face, at the absolute determination there, Diana knew he would simply carry her inside anyway. So she made the decision that would change everything. She placed her hand in his and let him help her out of the car. The smile Neil gave her was devastating, transforming his hard face into something almost beautiful. And Diana felt her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He guided her to the main entrance, where 2 security guards opened the double mahogany doors, revealing an interior that took Diana's breath away. The entrance hall was immense, with double-height ceilings, a crystal chandelier that must have cost more than her entire apartment, and a curved staircase leading to the 2nd floor. Everything was luxurious, but masculine, dark colors and clean lines, the kind of decoration that screamed power and control. Neil led her through the hall to a private living room, smaller and more intimate than the rest of the house, with a lit fireplace and leather sofas that looked incredibly comfortable. Then he finally released her, giving Diana space to breathe for the first time since he had taken her from the hall. Diana immediately stepped away, putting the distance of a sofa between them, and finally let her anger explode. She told Neil he was crazy, that what he had done was kidnapping, assault, and probably a dozen other crimes, and that she didn't care how powerful he was. She wouldn't be treated like property. Neil let her talk, simply watching with those penetrating blue eyes, and when Diana finally ran out of words, he responded with a calm that was somehow more frightening than any scream could be. He said Diana was right to be angry, that he had taken her choice from her in a brutal and public way, but that he didn't regret it. He said he had tried to do things the right way, that he had planned to approach her naturally, court her properly. But then Otto Johnson had appeared, and Neil had realized he didn't have time for courtship. Men like Otto didn't respect subtlety. They only respected strength. So Neil had done what was necessary to ensure everyone in Ashford knew Diana was out of reach. He said he understood if Diana hated him for it, but that hatred was better than the alternative, which was Diana becoming a pawn in power games between men who would see her only as leverage. At least as Neil's woman, she was untouchable. At least now she was safe. Diana wanted to argue, but Neil's words had a twisted logic she couldn't completely deny. She thought about Otto, about the way he had touched her waist, about the subtle pressure he had applied in recent weeks for her to commit exclusively to his businesses. Diana wasn't naive. She had felt something was wrong, that Otto wanted more than just her legal services, but she had ignored her instincts because the financial offer was too good to refuse. Now, seeing the situation through Neil's eyes, Diana realized how dangerously close she had come to becoming a tool in Otto's hands. She sat heavily on the sofa, suddenly exhausted, and looked at the ring still on her finger. It was heavy, masculine, clearly not made for a woman, but somehow it felt right there. Diana asked Neil what would happen now, what he expected from her, and Neil approached slowly, as if dealing with a frightened animal. He knelt in front of her, putting them on the same level, and took her hands between his. His palms were rough, calloused from years of work Diana could only imagine, and Otto's blood still stained his fingers. But his touch was surprisingly gentle. Neil said he hoped Diana would give him a chance, that she would stay there for a week, just 7 days, and let him prove they could have something real. He said he wouldn't force her into anything, that she would have her own room, her own privacy, but that he would do everything in his power to convince her they belonged to each other. And if after a week Diana still wanted to leave, Neil promised he would let her go without interference. Diana looked into his eyes, searching for signs of lies, but all she saw was brutal sincerity. Neil Carver was many things, clearly violent, possessive, dangerous. But at that moment he was being completely honest with her. He truly believed they had something special, that his obsession was somehow justified. Diana knew the smart decision would be to refuse, to demand he take her home immediately, maybe even risk going to the police despite his connections. But the lawyer in her, the part that analyzed risks and benefits, pointed out some inconvenient facts. First, she had accepted his ring in front of 300 people, including some of the most powerful criminals in the region. In their eyes, she was already Neil's property, and trying to deny that now would only make her a target. Second, Otto Johnson clearly wouldn't forget the humiliation he had suffered, and Diana doubted his anger would be limited to Neil alone. She had been the catalyst, and men like Otto blamed women for their own weakness. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, Diana couldn't deny the attraction she felt for Neil. It was wrong, it was dangerous, it was completely insane. But when he touched her, when he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, something inside her responded in a way she had never experienced before. So Diana did something that surprised her, as much as it clearly surprised Neil. She agreed to stay for a week. The smile Neil gave her was absolutely devastating, completely transforming his face, and Diana realized with a start that he was truly handsome when he wasn't threatening to kill someone. He stood up, pulling her with him, and said he would make every second of that week count. Then he guided her out of the room and up the curved staircase, leading her through corridors decorated with art. Diana was certain was worth millions, until finally stopping in front of a double door at the end of the main corridor. Neil opened the doors, revealing a suite that was larger than Diana's entire apartment. The bed was enormous, covered with sheets that looked obscenely expensive, and there was a separate sitting area with a sofa and television, plus doors that clearly led to a closet and bathroom. Everything was decorated in shades of cream and gold, feminine but elegant, and Diana realized with a shock that this wasn't a generic guest room. This had been prepared specifically for her. Neil confirmed her thoughts, saying he had ordered this room decorated 3 months ago, when he had decided he would eventually bring Diana home. He had chosen every detail thinking of her, the colors she wore, the style she preferred, and Diana didn't know whether to be flattered or terrified by the level of planning that had gone into this. Neil showed her the closet, which was already full of clothes, all in Diana's exact size, and the bathroom, which had a soaking tub that looked like a dream. Then he said goodnight and left, closing the doors behind him, leaving Diana alone for the first time since he had taken her from the hall. Diana stood in the middle of that luxurious room, still wearing the gala dress she had put on hours ago, thinking she would have a normal evening of networking, and tried to process everything that had happened. She had been publicly claimed by a crime boss. She was wearing his family ring. She was in his house, in a room he had prepared specifically for her months before even speaking to her, and she had agreed to stay for a week. Diana should be terrified. She should be planning an escape. But instead, she found herself touching the ring on her finger, feeling its weight, and wondering what the next 7 days would bring. She walked to the enormous window that dominated one wall of the room and looked outside. The property extended for acres, perfectly manicured gardens, illuminated by strategically positioned lights, and beyond the walls she could see the lights of Ashford twinkling in the distance. Diana thought about her life before that night, the predictable routine of work and loneliness, the empty nights in her apartment, the relationships that never led anywhere because no man seemed to really see her. And then she thought about Neil, about the way he had looked at her, as if she were the only woman in the world, about the way he had fought for her without hesitation, about the way he had declared in front of hundreds of people that she was his. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was completely wrong. But for the first time in years, Diana felt completely alive. She finally stepped away from the window and explored the bathroom, deciding a long bath was exactly what she needed to process the insanity of her new reality. The tub filled quickly with hot water, and Diana found expensive bath salts in a cabinet, along with everything else she could need. She sank into the water with a sigh, letting the heat relax muscles she didn't even know were tense, and closed her eyes. Images from the night flashed through her mind in disconnected fragments. Blood dripping from Neil's hand, his eyes fixed on her with that consuming intensity. The sound of his fist connecting with Otto's face, the weight of the ring sliding onto her finger, the way everyone in the hall had looked at her, some with envy, some with pity, all recognizing she had been marked, claimed, possessed. Diana opened her eyes and looked at the ring, which she hadn't removed even for the bath. The Carver family crest gleamed under the water, and Diana traced the contours with her finger. She was wearing Neil's ring. She was in his house. She had agreed to give him a week, and the scariest part was that Diana wasn't sure she wanted the week to end with her leaving. She finally got out of the tub when the water began to cool, and found a silk robe hanging on the door, soft and luxurious against her skin. The closet revealed not just daytime clothes, but also nightgowns and pajamas, and Diana chose a simple silk set before finally letting herself fall onto the enormous bed. She expected to lie awake for hours, her mind too agitated to sleep, but the emotional exhaustion of the night overcame her, and she fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. Diana woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains she had forgotten to close the night before. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing the room, and then everything came back in a wave. Neil, the hall, the ring, the promise of a week. Diana sat up abruptly and looked at the clock on the nightstand. 10 in the morning. She never slept this late, but apparently her body had decided it needed the recovery. There was a tray on the coffee table in the sitting area that definitely hadn't been there when she fell asleep, and Diana realized someone had entered while she was sleeping. The idea should have bothered her, but when she examined the tray and found black coffee without sugar, exactly how she liked it, along with fresh fruit and breads that were still warm, Diana couldn't help a small wave of pleasure. Neil had remembered. Of course he had remembered. He had said he knew everything about her. Diana ate slowly, savoring the coffee that was better than anything she normally drank, and tried to plan her next move. She needed normal clothes, not the gala dresses that dominated the closet, and she definitely needed her phone, which she realized she had left in her purse at the hall. As if summoned by her thoughts, there was a soft knock on the door. Diana said to come in, expecting a servant, but it was Neil who opened the door. He was different in daylight, wearing dark jeans and a black shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders, more casual, but somehow no less intimidating. Neil asked if she had slept well, if the coffee was to her liking, and Diana realized he was genuinely nervous. The man who had beaten Otto Johnson in front of 300 people was nervous about whether she had liked her breakfast. It was almost funny. Diana said yes, that everything was perfect, and then asked about her phone and her clothes. Neil entered the room completely, closing the door behind him, and explained he had recovered her purse from the hall, that it was in the closet, along with her fully charged phone. As for clothes, he had ordered more casual options brought in, but if Diana wanted something specific, he could have it fetched from her apartment. Diana shook her head, saying she would explore the closet first, and then there was a moment of strange silence between them. In daylight, without the adrenaline and drama of the previous night, the situation seemed somehow more real and more surreal at the same time. They were essentially strangers, but Neil had declared she was his, and Diana had agreed to stay. Neil finally broke the silence, asking if Diana would like a tour of the property to get to know the place that would be her home for the next week. Diana agreed, curious despite herself, and Neil smiled. He waited outside while Diana changed, choosing jeans and a simple blouse from the absurdly well-stocked closet, and then guided her through the mansion. The property was even more impressive in daylight than it had been the previous night. Neil showed Diana the library, which had floor-to-ceiling walls covered with books, many of them first editions that made Diana's fingers itch with the desire to touch them. He showed her the private movie theater, the complete gym, the indoor pool, the extensive gardens that were maintained by a team of 6 gardeners. He introduced Diana to the staff members they encountered, and each of them treated Diana with a respect that went beyond simple courtesy. They treated her as the lady of the house, and Diana realized Neil had already made it clear to everyone that she wasn't a temporary visitor. He was building a narrative, creating a reality where Diana belonged there, and she could feel that reality solidifying around her with each moment. They finished the tour on a private terrace on the 2nd floor that overlooked the entire property, and Neil finally addressed the elephant in the room. He said they needed to talk about Otto, about the consequences of what had happened the previous night. Diana agreed, and Neil explained that Otto Johnson wasn't the kind of man who accepted humiliation without retaliation. He was probably already planning his revenge, and that revenge could include trying to use Diana against Neil. Therefore, Neil needed Diana to understand she couldn't leave the property alone during the next week, that she would need an escort always, and that there were security rules she would have to follow. Diana knew she should feel like a prisoner, but the genuine concern in Neil's eyes prevented her from protesting. She asked what would happen after the week, if Otto would still be a threat, and Neil was quiet for a long moment before responding. He said it depended on Diana. If she decided to stay, if she accepted being his for real, then Neil would deal with Otto permanently. But if Diana decided to leave, Neil would ensure her safety in other ways, perhaps relocating her to another city, perhaps negotiating a truce with Otto. Either way, he wouldn't let Diana be hurt because of his actions. Diana processed that, the implication that Neil was willing to kill Otto if she stayed, and realized she should be horrified. But instead, she found herself asking what made Neil think she might want to stay after just one day. Neil turned to face her completely, his penetrating blue eyes fixed on her face, and said, because he had seen the way she looked at him the previous night. There was fear, yes, but there was also fascination, curiosity, and something more that Neil recognized because he felt the same. There was a connection between them, something primitive and undeniable, and Neil was betting everything that Diana felt it too. He said he would spend the next week proving they could have something real, something that went beyond obsession and possessiveness, something worth the risk. And then Neil did something that completely surprised Diana. He asked about her life, about her dreams, about who she was beyond the competent lawyer he had observed for months. They spent the next 3 hours on that terrace, talking in a way Diana hadn't talked with anyone in years. Neil asked questions and really listened to the answers, his eyes never leaving her face, his attention completely focused as if every word Diana said was precious. She talked about her mother, who was in a nursing home suffering from Alzheimer's, about how painful it was to visit and not be recognized. She talked about how she had chosen law because she wanted to help people, but had ended up in corporate law because bills didn't pay themselves. She talked about past relationships that had failed, because men always wanted her to be less intelligent, less ambitious, less everything that made her who she was. And Neil listened to everything, and then shared things about himself that Diana suspected he rarely told anyone. He talked about growing up on the streets of Ashford, about building his empire from nothing through strength and brutal intelligence. He talked about the loneliness of being at the top, surrounded by people who feared him or wanted something from him, but never really seeing him. He talked about seeing Diana for the first time 6 months ago and feeling something shift inside him, an absolute certainty that she was different, that she was what he had been searching for without knowing. Diana should have found that frightening, and part of her did, but another part was incredibly touched by Neil's raw honesty. When they finally went back inside, Diana realized the sun was setting, and she had spent almost the entire day with Neil. If you're enjoying this story of obsession and power, don't forget to check out the Dangerous Obsession ebook collection with even more intense adult stories. You'll find the link pinned in the comments and in the QR code on screen. These are narratives that will grip you from beginning to end. Dinner was served in an intimate dining room, not the formal hall Diana had seen during the tour, but a smaller space with a table for two and candles that created a surprisingly romantic atmosphere. The food was exceptional. Prepared by a private chef, Neil clearly paid very well, and conversation flowed naturally, building on the foundation they had established on the terrace. Diana found herself laughing at stories Neil told about his early days building his empire. Adventures that were clearly illegal, but that he narrated with self-deprecating humor that was unexpectedly charming. She shared her own stories of courtroom disasters and negotiations gone wrong, and Neil laughed in a way that completely transformed his face, making him look years younger. It was easy to forget in those moments that Neil was a criminal, that he had beaten a man the night before, that he had essentially kidnapped her. It was easy to just see the man who was genuinely interested in her, who made her feel seen and valued in a way no one else had. After dinner, Neil took her to the library, and they spent hours simply reading, sitting on opposite sofas but comfortably aware of each other's presence. It was domestic in a way Diana hadn't experienced in years, and she realized with a start that she was enjoying it. When it was finally time to sleep, Neil walked her to her room and hesitated at the door, clearly wanting to say something. Diana waited, and Neil finally spoke, saying he had enjoyed the day, that every minute with her had confirmed what he already knew, that Diana was special, that she was his. He said goodnight and turned to leave, but Diana called him back. She didn't know what possessed her, perhaps the magic of the day, perhaps the loneliness of years finally weighing too heavily, but she approached Neil and stood on her tiptoes, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. It was chaste, almost innocent, but the effect on Neil was electric. His eyes widened, and then darkened with something intense and hungry, and for a moment Diana thought he would kiss her for real. But Neil controlled himself, his hands closing into fists at his sides, and simply whispered goodnight before leaving quickly, as if he didn't trust himself to stay. Diana closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding hard, and realized she had crossed a line. She was no longer just tolerating the situation. She was beginning to want it. She was beginning to want Neil. And that realization was both exciting and absolutely terrifying. Diana prepared for sleep in a state of emotional confusion, her mind spinning with thoughts about what she was doing, whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life or finally doing something right. She fell asleep, thinking about blue eyes and strong hands, and a voice that said she was special. And for the first time in years, Diana dreamed about possibilities instead of just survival. The next few days fell into a rhythm that was surprisingly comfortable. Diana would wake to find perfect coffee waiting for her, spend mornings exploring the property or reading in the library, have lunch with Neil where they would talk for hours, and spend afternoons sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always aware of each other. Neil never pressed for more than Diana was willing to give, never tried to force physical intimacy beyond casual touches that still made her skin tingle. He was courting her, Diana realized, the way he had planned to do before Otto forced his hand. He was showing her who he was beyond the brutal criminal, revealing layers of complexity Diana hadn't expected. She discovered Neil read voraciously, that he had strong opinions about politics and philosophy, that he donated anonymously to charities that helped street children like he had been. She discovered he was fiercely loyal to the few people he considered his, that he had a code of honor that was inflexible even when it was inconvenient. She discovered that when he smiled genuinely, not the predatory smile he used as a weapon, but the real smile that reached his eyes, he was devastatingly attractive. And Diana discovered she was falling, fast and hard, for a man who was completely wrong for her in every way that mattered, but who somehow felt absolutely right. On the fourth night, everything changed. Diana was getting ready for bed when she heard a noise outside her window. She approached cautiously and looked outside, and her blood froze. There were men in the gardens, at least 6 she could see, dressed in black and moving with military purpose toward the mansion. Diana didn't think, just acted, running out of her room and down the corridor to Neil's suite that he had pointed out during the tour but which she had never entered. She knocked on the door frantically, and Neil opened immediately, clearly still awake despite the late hour. He was shirtless, and Diana had a moment of distraction noticing the defined muscles and scars that marked his torso before forcing herself to focus. She told him about the men, and Neil's face transformed instantly, all the softness he had shown in recent days disappearing, replaced by the lethal predator who had beaten Otto. He pulled Diana into his room, locked the door, and pressed a hidden button on the wall that made a panel slide open, revealing an arsenal of weapons. Neil armed himself quickly, taking 2 pistols and a knife he strapped to his thigh, and then turned to Diana. He said she needed to stay there, that there was a panic room behind another hidden door if things got bad, and that no matter what she heard, she shouldn't leave. Diana grabbed his arm, suddenly terrified, not for herself but for him, and begged him to be careful. Neil looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath and said now that he had something to live for, he would be more careful than ever. Then he kissed her, quick and hard, a promise and a claim, and left the room before Diana could process what had happened. She stood frozen for a moment, her lips still tingling, and then the reality of the situation penetrated. There were armed men invading the property, and Neil was out there facing them. Diana knew she should hide in the panic room as he had ordered, but she couldn't force herself to do it. Instead, she approached the door and opened it a crack, just enough to hear what was happening. Sounds of fighting echoed from downstairs, shouts and gunshots, and the sound of things breaking. Diana covered her mouth with her hand, trying not to scream, and prayed Neil would be okay. The minutes dragged like hours, each sound making her heart jump, and then finally silence fell. Diana waited, barely breathing, and then heard footsteps climbing the stairs. She stepped away from the door, looking for something she could use as a weapon, and then the door opened. It was Neil, alive and apparently unharmed beyond some scratches and blood Diana hoped wasn't his. He saw her, and something in his face softened. And then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight Diana could barely breathe. He whispered that she was safe, that he had taken care of everything, that no one would ever hurt her while he was alive. Diana clung to him, feeling his heart beating hard against her chest, and realized she had crossed the point of no return. She was no longer curious about Neil. She was no longer just attracted to him. She was completely, irrevocably in love with him. And that realization should have terrified her. But instead, it brought a strange clarity. Diana pulled back just enough to look at Neil's face, seeing the concern and relief there, and made a decision. She told him he didn't need the full week, that she already knew her answer. Neil went completely still, his eyes searching her face, clearly afraid to hope, and Diana smiled. She said she would stay, that she wanted to stay, that she wanted to see where this led. The smile Neil gave her was absolutely radiant, and then he kissed her for real. Not the quick kiss from before, but something deep and consuming that made Diana's knees weaken. His hands were in her hair, on her back, pulling her closer as if he could never have her close enough. And Diana responded with equal fervor, all the days of building tension finally exploding. When they finally separated, both were breathless, and Neil rested his forehead against hers, whispering that she was his now, completely, and that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never regretted that choice. Diana believed him. The following morning brought revelations Diana wasn't prepared to face. Neil explained over breakfast that the men who had invaded the previous night were Otto's, an attempt to kidnap Diana and use her as leverage. Neil had captured 2 of them alive, and they had confirmed Otto was planning something bigger, a move to destroy Neil completely. Diana asked what would happen now, and Neil said he needed to deal with Otto permanently, that there could be no peace while Otto was alive and obsessed with revenge. He asked if Diana could accept that, if she could live knowing Neil would kill for her, and Diana realized she already knew the answer. She had crossed into Neil's world when she had agreed to stay, and in that world, threats were eliminated, not negotiated. She told Neil she understood, that she trusted him to do what was necessary, and saw relief and something else, something like reverence, cross his face. Neil said he would need to go out for a few hours, that there were things he needed to arrange, but that he would leave his best security team with Diana. She would be completely safe, and he would return before nightfall. Diana agreed, and Neil kissed her long before leaving, as if memorizing her taste in case something went wrong. The hours Neil was gone were the longest of Diana's life. She tried to distract herself reading, exploring more of the property, anything to not think about what Neil was doing, but her mind kept returning to him. She found herself touching the ring still on her finger, its weight now familiar and comforting, and wondering when exactly she had become the kind of woman who accepted being with a criminal. But then she thought about how Neil looked at her, how he made her feel. And Diana knew there was no going back. She had chosen this path, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The sun was beginning to set when Diana finally heard Neil's car arriving. She ran to the entrance, not caring how desperate she looked, and when Neil entered, visibly tired but unharmed, she threw herself into his arms. Neil held her tight, breathing deeply as if her scent was a balm, and then said it was finished. Otto Johnson was no longer a threat. He didn't elaborate, and Diana didn't ask. She didn't need the details. She just needed to know they were safe, that they could move forward. Neil took her to the terrace where they had talked on the first day, and as they watched the sun set over Ashford, he talked about the future. He said he wanted to do things right, that he wanted to court Diana properly now that there were no pending threats. He said he wanted her to get to know the legitimate parts of his businesses, to consider working with him if she wanted to continue practicing law. Neil said he wanted to build something real with Diana, something that went beyond the initial obsession, something based on mutual respect and partnership. He said he understood if she needed time, that there was no rush, that they had the rest of their lives to figure things out. But then he did something that made Diana's heart stop. He knelt in front of her, right there on the terrace, and took a velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, not the signet ring Diana still wore, but an engagement ring with a diamond that probably cost more than she made in a year. Neil said he knew it was early, that they had only properly met days ago, but that he had waited months for her and didn't want to wait anymore. He said Diana was the only woman he would ever love, the only person who saw him completely and didn't run away, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving she had made the right choice in staying. He asked if Diana would marry him, if she would become his wife not just in the eyes of the underworld but legally, officially, permanently. Diana looked at the man kneeling in front of her, this complex and dangerous man completely dedicated to her, and realized her answer had been decided the moment he had placed his signet ring on her finger in that hall. She said yes. Neil's smile was absolutely devastating, and he slid the ring onto her finger next to the signet ring, doubly marking her as his. Then he stood and kissed her with a passion that promised everything. Every future day, every challenge they would face, every moment of happiness they would build together. When they finally separated, Diana realized she was crying, tears of happiness she didn't try to hide. Neil wiped them away gently, his blue eyes soft in a way she knew very few people had ever seen, and whispered that he loved her. Diana said it back, the words coming easily because they were absolutely true, and felt something click into place inside her. She had spent years searching for something without knowing what it was, going through relationships that never felt right, feeling incomplete and unsatisfied. And then Neil Carver had entered her life in the most dramatic way possible, had claimed her in front of hundreds of people, and somehow, inexplicably, had become exactly what she needed. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was completely unlikely. But it was theirs, and Diana wouldn't trade it for anything. They spent the rest of the evening planning the future, talking about marriage and where they would live, and how they would combine their lives. Neil said he wanted something small and intimate, just the people who really mattered, and Diana agreed. She didn't have much family beyond her mother, and the idea of a big public wedding seemed wrong for what they had. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Diana officially left her job at the law firm, causing shockwaves among her colleagues who couldn't understand why she was throwing away a promising career. She didn't try to explain. How could she make anyone understand she had found something more important than professional ambition? Neil introduced her to the legitimate aspects of his businesses, and Diana discovered he owned several real companies, real estate investments, and ventures that were completely legal. He offered her a position as in-house legal counsel, and Diana accepted, happy to have something productive to do. She met Neil's trusted men, those who formed his inner circle, and was treated with a respect that went beyond simple courtesy. They saw her as the boss's woman, and that meant she was untouchable, protected, valued. Diana visited her mother at the nursing home, and although her mother didn't recognize her, Diana talked about Neil, about how she had found someone who loved her completely. She didn't mention the darker details, but talked about how she felt safe, valued, seen, and in a rare moment of clarity, her mother squeezed her hand and said she was happy Diana had found someone. It was a precious gift, that moment of connection, and Diana treasured it in her heart. The wedding was held a month later, in a private ceremony on the Carver property. There were only 20 people present, Neil's inner circle and some colleagues of Diana's who had become friends over the years. Diana wore a simple but elegant dress, white and flowing, and when she walked to Neil waiting in the garden under an arch of flowers, the expression on his face made everything worthwhile. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and when they exchanged vows, Diana knew she was making the right choice. They promised to love, honor, and protect each other, and although the words were traditional, the weight behind them was anything but. They were committing not just to love, but to absolute loyalty, to partnership in all aspects of their lives, to facing together whatever the world threw at them. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Neil kissed Diana with a passion that made the guests whistle and laugh, and Diana laughed against his lips, completely happy. The reception was intimate and joyful, with exceptional food and conversations that flowed easily. Diana danced with Neil under the stars, her head resting on his shoulder, and felt a peace she had never experienced before. She belonged there, in this man's arms, in this life they were building together. When the night finally ended and the guests left, Neil carried Diana across the threshold of his room, not the guest room she had initially used, but the master suite that was now theirs. And that night, they became husband and wife in every sense, sealing their commitment with an intimacy that was both passionate and tender. The following months were the happiest of Diana's life. She and Neil fell into a routine that worked perfectly for both. Diana worked during the day, handling the legal aspects of Neil's businesses, and discovered she had a talent for navigating the complicated waters between legality and the gray zones where Neil's businesses operated. She was never directly involved in anything illegal. Neil ensured that. But she understood enough to be useful. The evenings were theirs, quiet dinners and deep conversations, and a physical connection that only deepened with time. Neil was an attentive lover, always ensuring Diana's pleasure before his own, and she marveled at how he could be both so gentle and so possessive. He still looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world, still touched her as if she were precious, and Diana never tired of that attention. They traveled together, Neil showing Diana places she had only dreamed of visiting, and in each city they created memories Diana knew she would treasure forever. She met other crime bosses, men and women who operated in worlds similar to Neil's, and was treated with the respect due to Neil Carver's wife. Some underestimated her initially, seeing only a pretty lawyer, but Diana quickly proved she had a sharp brain and an even sharper tongue when necessary. Neil watched these interactions with obvious pride, and Diana loved making her husband proud of her. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were moments when the reality of what Neil did weighed on Diana, when she heard whispers about violence or saw evidence of the darker parts of his businesses. There were nights when Neil came home tense and closed off, clearly dealing with something he couldn't share, and Diana had to respect those boundaries. There was the constant fear, buried but always present, that one day Neil wouldn't come home, that some rival or enemy would finally succeed where Otto had failed. But they worked through these challenges together, communicating openly about their fears and limits, and their relationship strengthened with each obstacle overcome. Diana learned to accept the parts of Neil she couldn't change, and Neil learned to open up in ways he never had with anyone. They became true partners, not just lovers, but allies in all aspects of their lives. And then, 6 months after the wedding, Diana discovered she was pregnant. The news left her simultaneously thrilled and terrified. Bringing a child into Neil's world seemed irresponsible, dangerous, but at the same time, Diana couldn't imagine anything she wanted more than to have a child with the man she loved. She told Neil during a quiet dinner, simply placing the positive pregnancy test next to his plate. His reaction was everything Diana could have hoped for and more. Neil went completely still for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the test, and then he looked at Diana with an expression of absolute wonder. He knelt beside her chair, his hands going to Diana's still flat stomach, and whispered that she was giving him the greatest gift, that he would spend every day ensuring both she and the baby were safe and loved. Tears ran down his face, the first time Diana had seen him cry, and she held his face between her hands, saying they would make this work, that they would raise a child together and give them the best life possible. Neil agreed, and then kissed her with a reverence that made Diana's heart melt. The following month saw significant changes. Neil began to step back from the more dangerous aspects of his businesses, delegating more to his trusted men and focusing on the legitimate companies. He said he wanted to be present for his child, that he wanted to be the kind of father he never had. And Diana loved him even more for that determination. They transformed one of the rooms into a nursery, painting walls and choosing furniture together. And Neil revealed a paternal side that was unexpectedly sweet. He talked to Diana's growing belly every night, telling stories to the baby and making promises about the future. Diana documented everything, taking photos and keeping a journal, wanting to remember every moment of that magical period. And then, on a cold winter night, Diana went into labor. Neil was by her side through the entire process, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, and when their son was finally born, a healthy boy with blue eyes like Neil's and dark hair, Diana saw her husband completely break down. Neil held the baby with surprisingly gentle hands, looking at his son with an expression of love so pure it made Diana cry again. He whispered promises to the boy, swearing to always protect him, to give him all the opportunities Neil never had, to love him unconditionally. They named the boy James, in honor of Diana's father, who had died when she was young. And Neil said it was perfect. The first months of parenthood were challenging, but incredibly rewarding. Neil was a dedicated father, waking for nighttime feedings and diaper changes without complaint. And Diana fell in love with him all over again, every day seeing him with their son. James grew up surrounded by love and security, protected by Neil's reputation, but never exposed to the darker aspects of his businesses. Diana returned to work part-time, but her priority was family, and Neil completely supported that decision. They found a balance that worked, dividing responsibilities and ensuring James always had at least one parent present. And through it all, the love between Diana and Neil only deepened, maturing into something solid and lasting. Years passed in the blink of an eye. James grew into an intelligent and curious boy, with Diana's intelligence and Neil's determination. They had 2 more children, a girl named Sophia and another boy named Thomas, and the house that had seemed so large and empty when Diana had first arrived, filled with laughter and love. Neil continued the transition to completely legitimate businesses, eventually becoming a respected businessman in Ashford, though whispers about his past never completely disappeared. Diana built her own reputation as a brilliant lawyer, eventually opening her own firm that specialized in helping small businesses navigate complex legal issues. She never forgot where she came from, and made a point of doing pro bono work for those who couldn't afford it. The story of how Diana and Neil met became legend in Ashford, whispered at social events, and used as an example of how love could arise from the most unlikely places. Some saw it as romantic, others as scandalous, but no one could deny they had built something real and lasting. Diana occasionally thought about that night in the hall, when Neil had crushed a crystal glass and walked toward her with murderous purpose, and marveled at how far they had come. She never regretted her decision to stay, to give Neil a chance, to build a life with a man the world saw as dangerous, but whom she knew as dedicated, loyal, and deeply loving. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Neil took Diana back to the hall where it all began. The place had been renovated, but the essence was the same, and Diana felt a wave of nostalgia as they entered. Neil guided her to the exact spot where he had placed his signet ring on her finger 2 decades before, and then knelt, just as he had when he proposed. He took a box from his pocket, and inside was a new ring, an eternity ring studded with diamonds that sparkled under the chandelier lights. Neil said he had spent 20 years proving Diana had made the right choice, and that he would spend the next 20 and the 20 after that continuing to prove it. He said she was his world, his reason for being, and that every day with her was a gift he would never take for granted. Diana cried, as she always did when Neil said things like this, and said he didn't need to prove anything, that she had known since that first week he was the right man for her. But she accepted the ring, letting him slide it onto her finger next to the other 2 she had never removed, and then kissed him right there in the hall, not caring who might be watching. They had started there, with violence and possessiveness, and a claim that had shocked hundreds of people, but had built something beautiful and lasting from that chaotic beginning. When Diana and Neil finally returned home that night, to the mansion that was now filled with family photos and children's toys and evidence of a life well lived, Diana reflected on the journey they had made. She had been a lonely lawyer, going through life without real purpose, and Neil had been a hardened criminal, building an empire but with no one to share it with. And then they had found each other in the most unlikely way, and everything had changed. It hadn't been easy. There were challenges and fears and moments when Diana questioned her choices. But through it all, Neil had been by her side, her partner and protector, and the love of her life. They had built a family, a legacy, a life that was worth every risk they had taken. And as Diana lay in Neil's arms that night, listening to his steady breathing as he slept, she knew with absolute certainty she would do it all again. She would choose Neil every time, in every life, in every universe, because he was hers, just as she was his, and nothing would ever change that. Their story had begun with a broken crystal glass and blood on the marble floor, with a public claim that had shocked an entire town. But it had transformed into something much deeper, something that transcended the dramatic circumstances of its beginning and became simply love, pure and true and eternal. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story of obsession and redemption, consider becoming a channel member to access exclusive videos or send a super thanks. Every donation made to the channel will be used to create new stories that will grip you from beginning to end. Your contribution makes all the difference and helps me continue bringing quality content to you. Until the next story.